there are just so many aspects of the way the world is now which reflect a sort of right hemisphere brain damage. I mean, humour is almost dead now. You can't make any jokes. I feel so sorry for comedians.
People trying to change the words of books as well.
Yes, oh, absolutely. Did I say that the left hemisphere was in charge of manipulation? They want to manipulate everything.
But I think the single most absurd, if we call it the sloganization of politics, is when the UN tweeted trans lesbians are lesbians.
Teaching children, for example, that there are no differences between men and women. And they come home and they're like totally confused. And we spend our time fussing about how traumatized we are because somebody used the wrong word or even the wrong pronoun.
Are we heading for collapse?
The first thing is that pretty much everything that most people have ever heard about hemisphere differences is wrong. And so they have to put that out of their minds. I was very much discouraged by my colleagues from going into this area because it was famously pop psychology and was now known to be quite wrong. But the fact that we'd answered the question wrongly didn't invalidate the question. It suggested to me having a better go at answering the question. And what I basically found out was that there's a good reason why all the neural nets and brains, a fortiori, have a kind of distinction between the two halves, are asymmetrical. And this even goes back 700 million years, at least we know that. And this distinction is in order to be able to manipulate the world, to get stuff out of it, to grab things, to eat, to build a nest, all this sort of stuff. You need a very kind of precise attention to a detail that you already know what it is, you know you want it, you go and get it. Whereas if that's the only kind of attention you have, you soon fall prey to a predator. While you're getting your own meal, you become someone else's. And so you need a completely different kind of attention, which is broad, open, uncommitted as to what it might find, sustained, vigilant. And to begin with, when I realized that the main difference between hemispheres was attention, the penny didn't really drop immediately, because I'd been trained in the cognitive paradigm whereby attention was just another brain function. But it isn't. It's much more than that. It's how the whole world that we experience comes into being. So what I mean by that is that depending on how you pay attention to something, you see something different there. And so the world that comes into being to meet your attention is in part generated by the kind of attention that you're already paying. And if you've got these two very different kinds of attention, you get two kinds of phenomenological worlds, in other words, experiential worlds. And what are they like? In the case of the left hemisphere, it's full of things that are known already. They're fixed, they're certain, they're detached, they're decontextualized, they're abstract, non-unique, and they are explicit. And that's what they are, and you know that you want to target it and get it. However, in the case of the right hemisphere, it's something completely different. It's a web in which nothing is ever completely separate from anything else, ultimately, in which nothing is ever completely certain, completely fixed. That doesn't mean chaos. It just means that there's room for maneuver, if you like. So this is a world in which there's subtlety, in which there is a lot that is implicit, is picked up by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere doesn't understand the implicit messages that are so important to meaning in life. And the right hemisphere's world is a living one, not an inanimate one like the left hemisphere's one. It's one which has meaning and value in it. And so really what you've got is a map in the left hemisphere and the world that is mapped in the right hemisphere. That's probably the easiest way to put it.
I see. And just to be sure, so the left, is that from me looking out, and that's my left?
The left is what you see when you look out. You know which your left hand is. The left hemisphere is the same side.
This would be my left hemisphere on my left.
That's right. But because of the way we're made, the left hemisphere governs the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere governs the left side of the body.
But how is that? So that's what's so strange for me, because obviously what you've explained is the left being quite stuck and not necessarily stuck, but okay, these are my fixed ideas, and the right being a little bit more fluid and nuanced.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet they're both responsible for controlling other sides of the body.
Yes.
So should my left side be slightly more nuanced?
Well, actually, there is an expression at the motor level, but I'm really talking at a much higher level than that of motority. But for example, the left hemisphere governs the right hand with which we do the grabbing, most of us, and the manipulating of things. And in fact, when people have damage to the brain in such a way that the natural function of that hemisphere is liberated, they randomly grab stuff with their right hand, even if they're just kind of grabbing stuff that's in the environment all the time. Whereas the left hand, if it is released in the same way, it does exploratory movements as though it's feeling its way to something and touching it and finding it.
Wow. That is incredible. I find all of this absolutely incredible. I do need to ask you, as we were talking about before, obviously my show, a lot of people watch it where we sort of talk about culture issues, culture wars and those kinds of things.
Yeah, let's go there.
Well, great. Then how does it, let's be as controversial as possible, how does it influence the kind of culture wars that we're seeing at the moment?
Well, I think it's not just the culture wars, but I will come to that, but it's the way we see the world in general now, which is a very simplified model, a reductionist, materialist model, in which there's lumps of stuff that have no meaning or purpose in themselves, that are pushed about in a sort of random way, colliding with one another, and that this produces a mechanistic world in which there is no real life. Life is a sort of artifactual emergence from mechanism, which nobody has been able to explain, and I don't believe. So when it comes to the culture wars, some of these differences come out. So, for example, one of the things one finds is extreme positions being adopted, because the left hemisphere doesn't do nuance. It's either this or it's that. There's a famous picture which Wittgenstein used in his philosophy, which was derived from a Victorian children's book, which shows what's called a duck rabbit. If you look at it one way, it looks like a duck. If you look at it another, it looks like a rabbit. And the left hemisphere is like, well, come on, is it a duck or is it a rabbit? Whereas the right hemisphere is going, mate, it's a duck rabbit.
I think mine said it was a horse's head.
It reminds you of the horse's head?
Yeah, mine was just a horse. When I saw that picture, I'm seeing a horse.
Oh, really?
I think so. Or maybe that's. I think I've got a third brain.
You've got a third brain in there, Andrew. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. No, really, what I'm saying is that any subtlety, any nuance, anything that comes from context, and context alters everything. Everything that comes from the realm of the implicit is missed. And the realm of the implicit, by the way, includes everything that we really value. So it includes, for instance, the beauty of nature, poetry, music, narrative, myth, ritual, sex, love, the divine. All these things remain implicit. They can be made explicit, but when they're made explicit, they change their nature and they become less than they were. And they may become completely other than they were. I mean, I sometimes have this little jokey thing, but it just illustrates very nicely how the context changes the meaning radically. So in America, there are 4 sizes of cereal packets. There is jumbo, which means very large. Then there is economy, which means large. Then there is family, which means medium. And finally, there's large, which means small. So the context changes the meaning of everything. And what's worrying, of course, is that on social media, things are taken out of context, remarks are taken out of context. They may have meant something very different in the context that they were being used. Also, the right hemisphere is much better at something called theory of mind, which basically means understanding what's going on in somebody else's mind. So the left hemisphere is not skilled at this, and so it misunderstands what is really intended by someone, especially if there's any hint of irony, humor, a metaphor being used. They're all taken terribly literally. I see this all around me. I mean, humor is almost dead now. You can't make any jokes. I feel so sorry for comedians. And I also feel sorry for us all, because frankly, humor is the stuff of life. If you lose your sense of humor and can't find things funny, you've lost a lot. You've lost a certain degree of life, and you've certainly lost a sense of proportion, which again, very obviously has gone amiss in the culture wars. There is no sense of proportion.
And is this because we've moved towards focusing more on the left hemisphere?
Well, it's because we've become more reliant on it, and there are various reasons why that may happen. I think it happens inevitably in a civilization after only a few hundred years. You can see it in certainly the ones that I know about, the Greek and the Roman, and in ours since the Renaissance. And it's strange, but the philosopher Ian Whitehead said the civilization is in its finest flower before it begins to analyze itself. And what happens is that if you're brought up in contact with nature, in a living tradition that is that of your culture, if you most probably go to a church where various things are imaged in ritual, in metaphorical language, in music, in pictures, this conveys things to you in a subtle way which you know in your heart to be true. So when you start to have a kind of legalistic argument about the nature of things, you're also very well embedded in an intuitive understanding of what's going on. But I think in the modern world, we've lost that embedding in any intuitive thing that would allow us to sense meaning. And so we argue about the nature of things. And if you do, you must be not contradicting yourself. Nowadays, the worst thing you can do is to appear to contradict yourself. But actually, since truth is complex, many-faceted, and there are different points of view, each of which may have something to be said for them. There's no place in this culture for that much more wise, deep, and reasonable way of talking, in which, yes, on the one hand, there's something in that, but what about this? And we've just lost that. We have to go for a single, very simple, black and white message, and most of those that go on in the culture wars are the most ridiculous examples of this taken to an extreme.
What do you have an example in mind?
Do I have an example in mind?
Are you concerned I'm tricking you into saying controversial things?
You are, yes. I'm going to resist it because I think every listener will have examples that they know. They won't be puzzled by my remarks.
I'm intrigued. I wonder which each has and which is, I think, and I've said this before, and I know some people might think I'm obsessing them, but I think the single most absurd, if we call it the sloganization of politics, is when the UN tweeted trans lesbians are lesbians, because that's just what is that?
I don't want to get bogged down in that particular discussion, but I think a lot of suffering is being generated by the confusion over these things, making people feel unsure, unhappy, insecure, and above all, teaching children, for example, that there are no differences between men and women. Or my Spanish colleague, Alex Gomez Marin, showed me some pictures that his little girls have brought home from school. I think they're 7 and 11 or something like that. And basically they have to place the penis on the woman and place the vagina on the man. And this is how they're being taught. And they come home and they're like totally confused.
But so then just to sort of raise that argument, are we being too left hemisphere? I must sound like a complete plonker talking to you about this, but just I'm a lay person. So are we being too left hemisphere by saying like, and taking it too literally? And should we be engaging our right hemisphere and going, well, they mean metaphorically and you know?
I think what we ought to do is redevelop a sort of wisdom and kindness, which is we do what seems reasonable and right. We don't get dogmatic about it. We don't force it down everybody's throats the whole time. In the course of my career as a psychiatrist, I looked out after a couple of people who were, as we now say, transitioning. I didn't think anything of it. They were perfectly happy doing it. They didn't need anybody crusading for them. But I think that what's happened is that in a rather patronizing way, a white middle-class liberal, in inverted commas, culture, which is actually profoundly illiberal, has taken the role of speaking up for people that were never asked whether they really wanted this bunch of people to be speaking up for them in this way. I mean, when I ever raise this or have the conversation raised around me with people who might belong to protected, as we call it, identities, they tend to be rather unhappy and unwilling to be treated in this way. They feel like it doesn't give them a chance to stand on their own feet, to demonstrate that they can do this for themselves and all the rest. So I think it's problematic in a lot of ways. One thing that we haven't talked about that is interesting in relation to this is that all that stuff that used to be said, like the left hemisphere is rational, non-emotional, and reliable, a bit like a boring accountant. But the right hemisphere is kind of fanciful and flighty and given to painting pictures. This is wrong. In fact, if anything, the right hemisphere is much, much more reliable than the left. The left is frankly deluded a lot of the time. And I'm not using that word in a loose, only metaphoric way. Those syndromes that result in delusions are practically all caused by damage to the right hemisphere. There's hardly anything that is caused by damage to the left hemisphere that leads to a delusion. So, of course, when the right hemisphere is damaged, the left hemisphere is going it alone. And it has no mooring in reality because it's very given to schemas, theories, and two-dimensional constructs of what reality is like. The right hemisphere has the job of going, well, let's test this against reality. I don't think this is right. But we don't listen to that voice anymore at the very moment when we need to be listening to it more. But anyway, what I was going to say is that the left hemisphere is emotional. The single emotion that lateralizes most strongly is anger. And guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere tends to be narcissistic. The right hemisphere tends to be more other-related, more able to feel what other people are feeling, think what other people are thinking, and so on. It's more egotistic. And I believe that a lot of the culture wars is dependent on groups of people getting narcissistically excited about something that they feel they're beyond reproach because they're so good, they've espoused this position. When actually a good person would not wish to gratify themselves by wielding power in this way, but would think, what is really going on here for these individuals and how do we treat them with compassion?
That's a fascinating point. Is there then a way to teach people to be more in touch with their more empathetic, more considerate right side?
Well, there's two levels to this. One is how can we literally teach people, but the other is teaching people the only way in which we manage to produce a change. And something I know, both from personal experience and from being a psychiatrist, is that often you know what people ought to do, but if you tell them right away, they won't do it because they need to be brought to the place where they see it for themselves, and then they won't need to be told what to do. So at that level, I feel my job is to do something that I feel I'm very lucky to be doing. And the feedback I get from readers is that whatever it is they've read has changed their lives. So this is a message that I think most readers would be very happy to have once in a lifetime. Your book changed my life. But it is honestly a message I get every day. I'm very grateful to people for writing, and please don't stop writing and telling me, because I need to hear it, because sometimes I doubt whether I'm getting across. But I think now I can accept that. So that's one level. If we can show people what it is they're missing, what has been taken out of their lives, all the things that inspire awe and wonder before the world, its beauty, its true complexity, its creative nature, its profoundly creative nature, whatever else the cosmos is creative. If we've stopped seeing this and stopped seeing ourselves as part of it, alienated ourselves from nature and started calling it the environment, which literally means something around you. But no, it's not around you. It's in you, and you are in it. We are nature. That's what we come from and where we return. So if you are able to see that, then you begin to inhabit the world in a different way. And so people say, you've changed the way in which I think about everything, so I now see it differently. Once you see this lens of these two ways of being, you see it all around you. To be a little bit more down to earth, if you like, but I think no more helpful, is, yes, we need to stop denigrating the humanities and really seriously build humanities into the core of our education. Because really the humanities are more of an education than the rest. The rest is often the learning of technical procedures. But it's the humanities that teaches one how to think, how to examine one's presumptions, how to see something that can't be reduced to figures, but actually needs to be understood, not just known about. And we stop at the realm of knowledge. We inject knowledge into people and then give them a certificate and say, on you go. But actually what the purpose of education is to teach people how to think for themselves and how to evaluate what it is they know.
But there's an issue there, which I think you would probably or possibly agree with, which is that, I mean, I studied English literature at university, and I'm a big fan of the humanities, but I'm sure you're aware that a lot of people who study the humanities and who teach it are not that open-minded and are very homogenous,
Yes.
left-wing, very left-wing,
I know.
very much on board with a lot of the progressive, social, postmodern woo-woo stuff.
Yeah.
So what do we do with that?
Well, I gave 2 lectures this last week, one a Darwin lecture in Cambridge and another an Exeter lecture in Oxford. And in the Oxford lecture, my theme was truth. And what has happened to truth? And is it related to the falling off of applications to university and indeed the rising costs of university? The rising costs I put down to the sudden explosion of administrative and managerial posts, which are very expensive. And although they may be necessary up to a point, when you have as much as we now have, they become counterproductive. They reduce flexibility. They slow down people's ability to think through projects. And, the weight of this kind of thing, which is all about making sure that the outcome fits the narrative that has been laid down, which is, that there must be equal everything represented, which may or may not be a realistic prospect.
Are we talking a little bit about DEI?
DEI.
Yeah, diversity, equity and inclusion officers.
Yes. And interestingly, a lot of it's about abolishing diversity and actually not producing a kind of equity, but an inequity in order to prove their own thesis correct. However, the truth I was talking about went much further than that. It was, first of all, what has happened to truth in the humanities? Well, when I was reading English, which was probably a long time before you were, the fashionable things were Marxism and deconstructionism. And I thought they were pretty grim, really, because they got between us and a magical body of poetry and literature that was a gift, and if approached in a generous spirit, would introduce you to things and give you insights that you would never have got otherwise. But now it's a business of confirming the hypothesis you start out with. There is a Marxist take on this, and this is what we will find. There is a feminist take on it, and this is what we will find.
We had to do Judith Butler was art we had to study.
That's right. And now there is a whole plethora of isms that will substitute not reading literature and riding roughshod over it for paying open attention to it for what it can teach us.
People trying to change the words of books as well.
Yes, absolutely. Did I say that the left hemisphere was in charge of manipulation? They want to manipulate everything so that it conforms to a theme that they're already familiar with. The left hemisphere sees these things and it knows what they are. It doesn't have any argument about what they might be. Ramachandran calls the right hemisphere the devil's advocate. And, it might be, but it might be something else. Let's find out. So the right hemisphere is much more open-minded. The left hemisphere is very closed-minded. It already knows what it knows, and it can't break out of this loop now because everything refers back to it. And I think that the advent of these large language models like ChatGPT will make this worse, because if you ask ChatGPT to answer a question, what it effectively does is a trolley dash around the internet and comes back with a confection that it has made out of this. And a lot of the stuff that is increasingly being put up on the internet comes out of ChatGPT and it's like already. So that this business involves putting out there stuff already generated by the left hemisphere and then looking at the world and finding, oh, yes, that's exactly what we thought. So how do you break out of this hall of mirrors?
It won't surprise you that I had Richard Dawkins on and he said some gender critical things. I don't think in any extreme way, but he just said, no, that's not possible. We're not fish. There's a particular kind of fish that can change sex, but that's not what we are.
Well, clearly.
The number of people in the comments who weren't even being particularly angry or anything like that, but who said, what a shame to see a hero of mine who clearly doesn't know enough about this. And you just think, like, what has gotten into these people who are just, like me, a Joe Bloggs layperson, to then think the world's preeminent biologist doesn't know as much as I do about biology.
Very, very odd. But that, you see, again, brings up the famous Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is very simple. It isn't rocket science, but it's well worth bearing in mind, which is that the less you know, the more you think you know. Whereas people who know a lot are aware of what they don't know and are much more willing to accept possibilities. So there's that, and there's also a very interesting other piece of research that Dunning and Kruger did, following on from that, which I've had reason to think about a lot when I look at organizations around the place, which is that when you have espoused a theory and you're sure that this theory is right, when you start implementing it, as they say, in an organization, and you find that, lo and behold, it doesn't seem to work, you don't have a little moment of, well, maybe we should reflect on this and see whether we've made a mistake. No, they double down their efforts. It's never that we're going in the wrong direction, or maybe, and this is very important, going in the right direction up to a point, but have now taken it too far and it's gone wrong. But the answer is only more of the same, please, which doesn't work, because as I often say, not only is space curved, but mental space is curved. When you push far enough in one direction, you find the very thing meeting you that you've been running away from.
So it reminds me of are you familiar with the fixed mindset and the growth mindset?
Yes.
I always forget her name, but I think it's Carol Dweck or Caroline Dweck.
Yes, I've heard of it. I couldn't tell you about it.
But the concept, the fixed mindset, things are not really going well. And rather than have the humility to have some growth and look at what other people are doing and go, oh, they're succeeding in a different way, I can learn from that. They're just going and going and going and still doing what they were doing before. They're fixed, they're stuck in a loop and blaming everybody else but themselves.
Well, when I use the terms left and right hemisphere, people think I'm using them metaphorically, but all these things are based on actual either experiments or on observation of patients who've got damage to one or other hemisphere. But the left hemisphere perseverates, which is a technical term in neurology, which means it carries on answering the same thing in the same way, never wishing to change. And brings the same mindset to everything. You ask them to do a different question, and they bring the same mindset from the last question. So there are just so many aspects of the way the world is now, which reflect a sort of right hemisphere brain damage. I can't put it, differently from that. That's how we now are. We're becoming more and more like machines, which is how the left hemisphere on its own thinks of itself and thinks of the world. So people who've got no functioning right hemisphere tend to see people as either robots or zombies, for example, which of course have become fashionable things to debate in philosophy. And a lot of philosophy, I'm afraid, is very captured by the left hemisphere at the expense of the wisdom the right hemisphere might have opened up.
Would that be a sign of narcissism, to see the rest of the world as potentially robots?
No, I wouldn't say that exactly. No, it's a terrible distortion in which you no longer can see what life is. But narcissism is another aspect of left hemisphere capture. And the certainty that you are right. And this is now gone to the point where, as I say, in the humanities, there is no longer any idea that there's a truth worth trying for. Now, of course, there doesn't have to be a single absolute truth. There won't be. But nonetheless, there are truer performances of a piece of music and worse performances that are not true to it. Equally, there are interpretations of Hamlet that are true to it in the sense that they really enrich our understanding, and the ones that just go contrary to it. And so we all believe in a kind of truth, however much we say, oh, there is no truth. In fact, to say there is no truth is itself a truth statement. And so that doesn't work, and we wouldn't get out of bed if there was nothing to be true to. So we need to recover the idea that there is a truth and it's worth seeking for, and actually eschewing pieces of nonsense that are being given to us and put in the way of it. And this actually liberates us into the idea that there's a possible range of truths here. I'm not trying to narrow things down to one truth. That's what dogma does. But the reverse of dogma is to say, well, that is a point of view, but there's also this other one, and so forth. And now, do you know, this is affecting science. So we're now aware that if you have a paper you have researched which produces a result which is contrary to the current narrative, you either won't get it published, or people call it pseudoscience. That's a very common one, even though it may be impeccably researched. But pieces of, frankly, pseudoscience that go to confirm the current narrative will be waved through and published and much lauded. So obviously there's an enormous disincentive to anyone to investigate anything that might come up with a result that would be politically
interesting.
Yeah.
Are you aware of the grievance studies guys? Peter Boghossian, Helen Pluckrose, James Lindsay, and they
that's wonderful. Yeah.
Made up fake papers or with very spurious evidence about mad things, and they got accepted into major publications.
But what really worries me is this thing that proper research and proper science is being barred, because if in the future we can't rely on science to answer our questions dispassionately, how are we ever going to know what's right?
Do you have examples of the kind of thing that's not being let in? Are we talking, I've heard some people speak about just wanting to study eugenics, for example. Not eugenics in the Hitler way, but just an intriguing, I wonder if people are different because of whatever. What kinds of things?
Well, you're right. Differences between the sexes, differences in races, differences in cultures, all these things. And, they do exist. I mean, manifestly, there are open physical differences, and there are different diseases that go with different racial. I'm
Jewish and I'm more prone to things
Tay-Sachs disease and so forth.
What was that one?
Tay-Sachs is
I didn't even know that
a neurological disease that is
that for Jewish
Ashkenazi Jews. Yeah,
did another one? I knew of Crohn's. Crohn's is
I think
popular
is,
in
yes,
Jews.
That's right.
Popular.
But no, I mean, diseases tend to be commoner in certain racial groups. Reactions to medications and treatments vary between racial groups. All this has to be taken into account. And we know that the cardiovascular system is different. So it's kind of counterintuitive that you would say that, say, other parts of the body were not going to be possibly different. Mm-hmm. But to find out what they are might actually be quite helpful, as it's helpful to know that, what you're looking at when you're looking at a physical dysfunction.
I'm a multilinguist. I love languages. I'm really into my languages. And I found a similar thing in languages that nobody wants to look at, which is, do you know of the Sapir-Whorf theory? So for those who don't, Sapir-Whorf, the movie Arrival about the aliens, which was brilliant. Have you seen that?
No.
Oh, it's a bit sci-fi and aliens, but genius, beautiful. The theory is you learn the aliens' language and you experience time differently. They begin to realize that, and the whole movie goes in a loop.
Absolutely.
It's fantastic. And it's the idea that's been much debunked, but there are some aspects that appear to be true, that if you learn a different language, you can have these sort of superpowers, and one of those might be a different sense of space because people use cardinal points instead of left and right in some languages. So that's one example. And I remember I asked John McWhorter, how much credence do you give to the Sapir-Whorf theory? And he said the problem is we can't even look at it because people are only interested in academia in looking at what advantages other languages have. They never want to look at what the Western languages have over those. So it's just he was like, I can't even look into it, so it doesn't matter.
No. Well, yes, and Sapir-Whorf has largely been discarded, and I think rightly. I mean, all this stuff about if you haven't got a word for it, you can't see it. Well, this is not true. And I've written about this in The Master and His Emissary. And actually, the Eskimos don't have 100 words for snow. They have about 7. And we have quite a lot. We have sleet, we have slush, we have...
and we still understand different states of snow.
States of snow. So, and, people who don't have a word for pink can recognize pink in the wallpaper catalogue just like anyone else. So that bit is wrong. But what is interesting is that when one learns a language, one learns a whole way of looking at the world at a less specific level than a single word either being there or not. So when, for example, a Frenchman says, "J'ai envie de manger," he means something different from, I'd like to get something to eat, because the whole concept of eating, what it means, what it's like, where it fits into life is different from ours.
Yes.
And Goethe said something like, "So viele Sprachen man spricht, so viele Leben hat man gelebt."
As many languages you lived, there's many lives you lived.
So many lives.
I had to butt in and show off I understood. Sorry, go on. It's very important because one doesn't get to do that very often in life. I spend a lot of time learning languages. And it's
now
when do I use it?
When do I use it? Well, you just did beautifully.
Never use it.
So what this really shows is that, you do actually experience the world differently when you're speaking a different language.
Yes, I think so. And then I'm reading about, I can't remember the name of the man, which is unfortunate, but he's Israeli, and it's called something Through the Language Glass or Through the Language Ceiling, something like that. It's brilliantly written. And he contends that there are 2 or 3 places where the Sapir-Whorf theory, in a way, is sort of true. One of them being spatial, others being colours, the way that Homer didn't have colours or whatever.
Well, we don't. Yes, Homer is a controversial one actually, but yes.
He spent like chapters on it, and fascinating though.
Yes. But why was the sea wine dark? Excuse me.
The sea was wine. Everything was wine. And amazing to see that every group of people, every language sort of started with black and white, and then they added red as a colour, and then everything was either black, white, and red. And then people used to think it was that they couldn't see the colours, but of course they could. Of
course they could.
But absolutely fascinating to think of. Yeah. On language then, okay, so language is on one side of the brain. Which side is that?
Well, I mean, your native language, the most of the dictionary is in the left hemisphere, but it's not as though the right hemisphere doesn't have quite a large lexicon, including unusual and abstract words. So it's not as simple as people make out.
Fascinating.
And different aspects of utterance are served by the right and left hemispheres. So the left hemisphere has a more complex and sophisticated syntax than the right, but there are certain syntactical things that the right hemisphere gets right and the left hemisphere gets wrong. But outside of that, there's a very important aspect. There are 2 important aspects. One is prosody, which is the intonation. And, the intonation changes the meaning entirely. If I say yes, or I say yes, or yes, and yes.
And that's the right.
That's the right.
It's a modifier.
And yes, but also it is the one that understands the meaning overall of an utterance. So the left hemisphere is a bit more like what a computer would do if you gave it the complete Oxford English Dictionary and a set of rules and asked it to say what is being said. But the right hemisphere understands what is being said, if you like, between the lines. So that, if I say it's a bit hot in here today, the left hemisphere very literally goes, the temperature is too high, could you turn on some air conditioning? Whereas the right hemisphere, unwanted meteorological information actually, it's the right hemisphere that says, what I really mean is, could we open a window? So all the indirect expression, which turns out to be much of what we use, is better understood by the right hemisphere. And I had this experience. I went to research in neuroimaging at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, and we were looking at asymmetries in the brain of people with schizophrenia. And the first 3 or 4 weeks, I kept talking to people and having this puzzled reaction, and they'd go, "Really?" And then I go, "No, not really, but never mind." And basically everything I said, I hadn't realized how much of what I say is tinged with irony, is said to amuse, and everyone understands that in an English culture. but they clearly don't in America, and this is an observable fact. I'm not the only person who's noticed this. So, and I think that all the things that I've pointed to as undesirable aspects of the way we think and speak are probably stronger still in America. And, I thought at the time, I was there in 92. And I remember thinking, this is going to come our way. And it is beginning to come our way. People don't get it when you say, you have to be very straightforward, and certainly don't try and make any jokes or anything, for God's sake.
Well, could it be, just to build that side up a little bit, that we just have different habits that we're used to, different kinds of irony? Because I've always heard it said, Americans don't get sarcasm. And then you think of Friends and Chandler, who's like could I be any more sarcastic? Like, he's the sarcasm guy.
Okay.
So it might be that we have and we're more used to their cultural mores because we watch the TV with all the American stuff, whereas we're saying things with a little accent, and they think we're all just very serious professors. I mean, you are a professor, but you're not always serious, are you? But you're expected.
I hope not.
You're expected to be. What about swear words? Are they in the different part of the brain?
Swear words are very interesting. The urge to utter a swear word seems to come from very low down, neither from right or left, but from the basal ganglia. Which is why people who have a condition called Tourette syndrome, which most people will know about, but for those who don't, it involves compulsive twitching movements of one's limbs and sudden utterances of a swear word in the middle of something, which is quite embarrassing for the person. They can't inhibit it. And these words come, and we know that Tourette's is a problem of the basal ganglia. That's where they come from. But there is evidence from hemisphere damage that suggests the right hemisphere is more conducive to these expressions. It may be because the left hemisphere needs explicit context and a sort of ability to analyze an utterance to see what it means. So, it is hot in here today. Okay, but fuck. Now, why fuck? Where does that come from? Whereas the right hemisphere is perceiving an emotional expression of a whole cast of mind right now. And so it is true that when people have left hemisphere damage, one of the things that can be preserved in the right hemisphere is swearing to begin with, before you get other things. But the other things that you get are very interesting. Say, for example, people may not be able to speak sentences at all, but they can sing a whole song. So as long as the words go with music, they can utter the whole thing. And one of the ways of encouraging them to get their speech back is by helping them to sing things that they know. And
it's extraordinary.
It is, yes.
I saw a video on YouTube, and that was the reason I asked about swearing and if it's in a different part. I think it was Stephen Fry. He had to hold his hand in cold water.
Oh, yes.
And the
more he swears, the longer he can keep it in.
Yeah. That's mad. And then, so that's interesting with regards to the changing nature of offence and swearing. There's this theory, it was John McWhorter, the linguist, and I found it fascinating that if you look over the last couple hundred years, swearing has gone from the religious, damn, hell, carnation, or whatever. Is it carnation? Is that what people say?
Yes.
Carnation. It must be
tarnation.
Tarnation. Eternal damnation. Tarnation.
Tarnation.
And then gradually those sort of wore out, and it became bodily as we became obsessed with the sex and things and fuck shit and all that. And today, the ones I wouldn't even say today would be the identity ones, the N-word, the F-word for gay people.
They're sort of different, though, because they're not words one's inclined to utter in the same way that one goes fuck.
That's true.
They're just words that one's been taught to censor, which is different. Doesn't mean that they are swear words. It means that they're not allowed words now.
But they go in a sacred space, it feels. They go in a separate sacred space.
Yeah, I would resist the word sacred because it is an important word, and I think it can be misused. But if you mean a sacrosanct area, where, as it were, in common parlance, yes, I think what happens is that attached to them is a range of sort of warning signals, so that when your mind gravitates to them, there's this very strong inhibition. No. which would also possibly be recruited in some cultures by certain swear words, but it is intriguing.
That's the word that I presume the identity ones, even though you're absolutely right, you don't have that urge to shout them out in that sense. That would maybe encourage this or stoke the strongest response in you if somebody suddenly said those words, I imagine. So that's what I'm wondering. I'm just sort of wondering, I don't know what my question here is, except when we talk about offence and the nature of offence, it has moved towards identity. And I feel like swear words and these kinds of sacrosanct words play a part.
Well, of course, they've become, at the same time, completely unsanctioned. You can use them. I mean, for example, I've just used one twice.
Bodily ones. The bodily
ones.
Fuck you. The C word you can't, though, because the C word has
it's got into feminism. Yes.
And an identity.
Yes.
So it's to do with identity. So that's bodily and identity.
Yes, I know. But I mean, get on with it. I mean, honestly, there's so many things in the world to worry about that are really important. We should be moving our minds to, there are crises all over the place. And we spend our time fussing about how traumatized we are because somebody used the wrong word or even the wrong pronoun. Well, I'm sorry. I think that shows a complete lack of sense of proportion. And I don't think that shows that I'm just an insensitive white male. I mean, no doubt lots of people will say that. But I don't think that's it, actually. I think that it's that we would all get on better if we took certain ideas about ourselves slightly less seriously. And in my experience over my lifetime, I've seen something really interesting, because I'm 70. And over my lifetime, I've seen the relations between the sexes and the relations between the races, which used to be relatively unproblematic, become seriously problematic. And I've also noticed, and this is not just me noticing it, but that certain other things have happened. There's a widening of the gap between the rich and the poor, not a closing of it. There's been the widening of resentments as we've fallen over ourselves to try and not cause offence. Resentment has grown. And you see, these are the little paradoxes the left hemisphere doesn't understand, because it's very simple-minded. We do this, and surely that will help, and it's going in that direction. But it isn't, actually. What it's doing is it's having all kinds of other effects that you're not taking into account. And one of the effects is going to be one that nobody will like, which is the sort of what I could call for short the Trump effect. Now, lots of American viewers and listeners don't like me using Trump as an example of somebody who's not too bright. And I think actually it's wrong to use him as an example, because I think he probably is perfectly intelligent.
Different kinds of intelligence. But I think that the explanation for how a lot of educated and intelligent people vote for Trump is just that they think that somebody's got to take a stand against the whole culture of political correctness and the distortion of the educational system, the sheer injustice that's meted out to anybody who's white or male. They won't get to university even though they may be the strongest candidate because others have preference. Now, it's extraordinary that people in the name of justice can do that and not expect there to be a strong reaction to it. It's a misunderstanding or misreading of history as well, because we've been here.
Yes.
The Bolsheviks did similar things.
Yes.
It doesn't end well.
No, it
fosters
doesn't.
resentment.
No.
I started doing this podcast, and forgive me everyone who knows this already, but Iain might not know, because I was making I tried to make Louis Theroux kinds of documentaries and things, going to hang out with neo-Nazis or whatever it might be, and all that stuff. And I made some that went to BBC and HBO and stuff like that. And I started getting told that if I was to continue, I would have to be off-screen and to have somebody in my place who's from a minority. And that fostered resentment in me. I was livid. I heard it about 100 times from 100 different production companies. And then to go to my friends, many of whom obviously, studied the humanities at university, those kinds of things, but you can imagine the politics they had.
Oh, I know.
They just said, well, that doesn't happen. They just told you that to spare your feelings, maybe, because you weren't good. It's like, well, that seems a strange thing to tell me, to spare my feelings. We don't want you on screen because of your skin colour and gender, or
Yes.
So, and all it did was foster resentment and push me away from a cause. Another thing is, I used to not be offended. I remember growing up 15 years ago, I have friends who made jokes about me being Jewish, and I understood that they come from a good place. And I'm not so stupid. I guess the right hemisphere could understand, okay, it comes from a good place. This person's married to a Jewish woman or whatever it might be. Yeah. But now as it becomes so, we're so offended by everything else, if I've got a woke friend who makes a joke like that, I am offended now. Because I go, well, why won't you make those jokes about other minorities? What are you saying about Jews?
Jews, exactly right. And of course, it's visible that certain groups are, as it were, fair game, and Jews seem to be one, and and others are very clearly not. So, what are these double standards? What is this about justice? What is and the thing that is so sad about humour is, first of all, humour doesn't have to be in any sense derogatory, but also when you pull somebody's leg about anything, it's a sign of, it's actually a kind of a bond. It's a way of showing that there's some sort of, we understand one another and we're safe to talk in this way, and you don't think I'm an enemy here, and so it actually helps to heal. Often, being allowed to make a few not Bernard Manning type jokes. I mean, I once thought, what is this Bernard Manning? And I actually clicked on a link to find out what he was like, and I thought he was A, boring, and B, rather disgusting, and not funny. So, but
this is a racist comedian from a few decades back, just for those who don't know.
Yes, a racist comedian. But one should be able to make these sort of jokes. I remember seeing Richard Pryor at Sunset Strip, which is a film of Richard Pryor on stage, and one of the funniest things he did was a sketch of a Chinese waiter with a stutter. Now, nowadays, I don't know where that would go, but it didn't make me think less of the Chinese at all. It didn't make me think less of Richard Pryor.
And I suppose you also had an awareness of, okay, if we do this too much, then it's not good for Chinese people, it's not fair on them.
That's exactly the point. There is a happy medium between nothing and everything. Yes. But that is never possible now, to make a graded response. I remember being taught at school that it was said in the 19th century, the whole point of an education is to enable somebody to give consent or dissent to a proposition in graded terms. Now, I think that's a very important idea. And if we could get that back, as well as the idea of listening to one another and being allowed to joke with one another a bit, but let's leave that sticking to the wall, because that will never happen anymore. But, being able to have a civil discourse. I mean, civil discourse could avoid so much aggro, so much violence, so much stupid, unnecessary banging together of heads. For example, I don't know if you've ever had couple therapy, but I think that almost everybody should have couple therapy, whether they're in a couple or not. Because in couple therapy, what you do is you get one person talking and the other one sort of says, but hang on, and you say, no, let him or her speak. You'll have your turn in a minute, and you won't be interrupted. So you hear what the person has to say, and then they stop. And then the first thing you say to the other person is, what did you just hear said? And that is so valuable, because very often they go, well, thank you for telling me that, because that's not at all what I was saying. And if people were more willing to do this, the world would be a better and happier place.
It's like the, is it the Socratic method, where you have to build up the other person's argument until that person is satisfied?
Yes.
So they say, okay, so what you're saying is this, and you go, no, try again.
Yes.
And you have to keep doing it until they're satisfied, and only then can you engage in the debate.
Yes, that part of it, yes.
I did a lot of therapy over the years, particularly because I spent 6 years in Buenos Aires, which is the world capital of therapy, of therapists.
Okay.
They're very Freudian, which I know is not very in vogue now, I suppose, but it still helps if there's a good therapist, there's someone to talk to. And it was like effectively a free Spanish lesson. Well, it wasn't free, but it was very affordable because there were so many. It was about £10 equivalent per hour or whatever. And my word, did it help me. My word. And I went in going, I don't need any help. And I spent the first few times just telling this poor man about how everyone in my life is to blame for everything that's wrong in my life. And he said to me, like 6 months later, when I came to realize that wasn't necessarily the case, he said, it's amazing how many people come in and blame everyone else around them. Yeah. And his job is to very, very subtly start to make you understand that it may well be their fault, it may not be, but you have to accept and choose what you're going to accept and choose what you can't change. And that changed a lot for me, not having that impulse to try and make everybody fit what will make me comfortable.
Absolutely. And one of the misconceptions is that psychiatrists will tell you, oh, it's all the fault of your parents. But a good psychiatrist will never tell you that. A good psychiatrist will say, well, let's not go into blaming your parents. They probably did the best they could. We don't know what their problems were. But whatever the story there, you have to take the situation as you find it now and what you're going to do about it. So take responsibility. And behind the wish to blame everyone else is the unwillingness to accept responsibility for any of your actions, which of course is absurd. It's treating yourself as a child, whereas, you are an adult and you therefore take responsibilities for the things you say and do. And whatever happens to you, we have this kind of, again, mechanistic view, which is very left hemispheric. The way I am is because of things that happen to me. This is almost invariable view.
I hate that.
It's so often untrue that it's very rare that it is true. So people can be traumatized by having been through nothing that anyone would recognize as remotely traumatic. Other people can have been through genuinely traumatic things in wars or torture or so on, and pull themselves together, survive, and be tough and get on with it. So I'm not saying there's no such thing as trauma. There clearly is, and I've treated people for it. But I think our tendency to hide behind that is a shame, which weakens us and makes us less able to be resilient. And once again, I'm sorry to relate everything to, but it's just such a clear picture. But it does relate to the left hemisphere, because the left hemisphere always is in the right, and it never has a problem. If there is a problem, it's someone else's problem. And the most dramatic example of this is one I'm afraid I've often talked about. But it is what happened when somebody has a right hemisphere stroke, and so they've got a left paralysis in their arm, their leg, whatever. And you come and see them and you say, are you okay, having had this stroke? And they say, fine. You say, but what about moving your left arm? Can you do that? And they say, yes. Well, go on, show me. And then they go there, and nothing actually moves.
Wow.
And then if you bring it round in front of them and say, now move that, they say, oh, that's not my arm, doctor, that's your arm.
They don't say that.
Yeah, or it belongs to the patient in the bed over there, or it's my mother's.
Oh, so really, because of the stroke, they've become delusional?
Because of the right hemisphere stroke, they've become delusional. And one of the ways in which this is expressed is that everything is somebody else's fault. So this goes with the territory of being locked into this shallow, emotionally shallow, angry, aggressive, narcissistic, I'm right, it's down here, anybody who disagrees with me must be wrong. This is a toxic way of behaving and a very silly way of behaving. And if only people realize how foolish they make themselves by behaving so badly, we might have a happier world, a more compassionate world, a world in which we try to understand one another's positions and don't rubbish them and think that they must be stupid to hold a different position, and so on. I don't think that people who take these positions are stupid. I think they've got locked into a pattern of behavior that they could be helped to free up and leave behind.
I can only speak anecdotally, but yeah, I certainly see people who are more often victim signaling or showing what a victim they are, and bullying traits. And there has been research showing, I believe, that the dark triad trait. Some people who victim signal and virtue signal more often are more likely to have dark triad traits.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question about it that virtue signaling is a cheap way of getting special privileges, being treated, in a certain way, being and people manipulate that, I'm not saying there's no such thing as having had a rough experience in life. Of course there is, but it doesn't actually, by the way, always correlate with the results.
It's also something that I want, and I feel like you feel this way as well. I want everybody to experience what it feels like to be able to accept that not everyone else is to blame. Because I do feel like I got stuck in that loop a little bit. And maybe a lot of people when they're younger do. I don't know. I feel like when you're young, you're quite self-obsessed and everything's your parents' fault and everyone else's fault. And Obviously, it hurt at first to start recognizing that maybe things are my own fault, and it's painful.
Yeah.
But after that, you feel invincible.
Yes.
You go, oh wow, I can just do my thing and not worry that other people are like, oh, they've judged me, they've said the wrong thing to me, they've done this, everyone's done.
Yes.
Oh well.
Yes.
As Jordan Peterson, he's popular because make your bed. Make your bed, and what's the word? The feeling it gives you. It's I guess emboldening. Emboldening.
Emboldening, yes. Yes. Or
enriching.
As we say now, empowering.
Empowering, yes. I know, that's become a buzzword.
It has.
I've lost it from my mind.
And guess what? The only value of the left hemisphere that it recognizes, because it's the one that's to do with using, getting, grabbing, is power. And the subtler things like beauty, goodness, and truth go out of the window. And the right hemisphere is much better at reorientating us to these values. There's a lot more to say about that, but I've said it many times and it's in my books.
Well, here's a question then. You said before it feels like we've got sort of brain damage on the right as a society.
Yeah, I'm talking very loosely.
Yes, exactly. So then I wonder what has happened. Is it that we have created a society that incentivizes? I mean, if I think about this YouTube, I'm incentivized to have binary thinking and to make the title something sensationalist, and I hope people will click and listen and see it's not actually that sensationalist.
Yes.
And it will do well. And I think there are all different parts of life now where we are incentivized, all social media. So is that what's happening?
Well, yes. I mean, I think I mentioned that I've seen a certain pattern in Western civilization where there is a sudden, it's not a gradual, it usually happens very quickly. There's a sudden efflorescence of what the best of the left and the right, when they work together, can produce. And by the way, left is not science and right the humanities. Left and right are important for science, and left and right are important for humanities. But what we get is, as at the 6th century BC in Greece, or again around the year dot in Rome and in the Renaissance, a burgeoning of everything, of mathematics, of cosmology, of music, of drama, of lawmaking, of all the things that make a society civilized. And these then produce stability for a few hundred years. And then after a while, the thing degrades always by shifting more towards the left hemisphere's point of view. And I think this is due to many things, but one is due to a civilization overreaching itself, either territorially or commercially or whatever, so that it has to administer on a huge scale. And this automatically makes things crude. They have to be simple paradigms that can be rolled out, as we say, anywhere in the world, whatever the culture there is. And the individual is lost, the life in it is lost. It becomes steeply hierarchical, it becomes very doctrinal and dogmatic. And you can see this in the art. As the civilization declines, it becomes more stereotypical, more less empathic towards its image figures and so forth, more hierarchical. So that is a pattern, and I think it happens because we overreach ourselves. But there are a few other things. I mean, one is that it's money for old rope to put across the left hemisphere's point of view, because it's so darn simple. It's just that there are bits, and we put them together and they make something, which is how you make a machine. But in the vastness of the universe, there is almost nothing at all that is at all like a machine. There's just the few machines we have made that are like machines. Nothing else is. Not only is life not like machines for 8 or 10 reasons I could give you, but it's not that the inanimate world behaves like machinery either. We now know, indeed, that physics doesn't obey those Newtonian mechanics. And we've known that for at least 100 years. So we need to break out of this mindset, and it's partly that, I think, that is pushing it. And it's this business that I mentioned that Whitehead said that once you start analyzing yourself, it makes everything very crude, because the answers to these questions have to be derived from public discourse such as we're having now, and in which if I say, well, on the one hand and on the other, which would be very reasonable, I appear to be either contradicting myself or have nothing important to say, whereas actually that's truthful. And as I say, we've lost the the skill to listen to things that speak to us implicitly. Even the arts now have to speak explicitly. So when you go to an art gallery, you look at a painting of the 15th century, and you only need to see the painting. There's things that an art historian can draw your attention to and so on. If you go to a modern art gallery, there'll be a text by the artist saying what he had in mind or she had in mind when they made the picture or the installation or whatever it is. The same thing with music. What the composer, before it's given its first performance, what I was trying to achieve was. Bach never said that. And didn't need to, because we only have to listen to it. So things that speak to us intuitively speak to us profoundly. When they're reduced to the superficial level of everyday language, you're reduced to the language of everyday use for a dishwasher manual. And as Nietzsche said, words make the uncommon common.
Wow. And Roland Barthes' The Death of the Author seems to no longer apply because the author's getting a bit involved, isn't it?
Well, I think the trouble with that is that it's dehumanizing the utterance, because these things are utterances of people. Mm-hmm. And the idea that they're not is, I would identify that with the general move to dehumanize the humanities, actually.
I see. But with everything that you've said, and based on previous civilizations then, are we heading for collapse?
Well, I think we might be, yes. In a way, these are natural cycles. We shouldn't expect a civilization to go on forever. No. There's a wonderful little book called Immoderate Greatness, and the author, it's only about 80 pages long without the notes. It's a model of lucidity, and it's a wonderful afternoon to read. I do recommend it. The author is called Offence, and I can never remember whether it's Patrick or William. One is his real name and the other is his pseudonym. Oh. But anyway.
A lot of use that was. The pseudonym was now as sort
of... Yes. I want to say to him, if you wanted to hide, it was Offals that needed to go, not Patrick or William. But anyway, there it is. And he basically says there are 6 reasons why civilizations collapse. And 3 of them are to do with external constraints like the environment and the damage that's done and exhausting resources and so on. But the other 3 are to do with the cast of mind. And that's much closer to mine, although he doesn't talk about hemispheres, of course. But because he wrote before I'd written. But one of the points he makes, which I think is very good, is that in the beginning of a civilization, people are very self-denying. They risk their lives to build something. They often have to fight to keep off people. They build something strong and secure, and they devote themselves to that. The next generation comes along, and they're able to build on that, what we think of as civilization. The arts, civil discourse, philosophy, all these things. Wonderful. But after a while, after perhaps a couple of 300 years, people no longer see the connection between what they do and think and the existence of that civilization. They become entitled. They think they're entitled to what, it's my right to have this, that, and the other. Well, actually, where does that right come from? It's actually something which should come from the reciprocal relationship between you and a community, you and a society. The society helped form you, who you are, and give to you, and you must give back to them and help further the goodness of that society. Whereas now we have this atomistic thing where it's each of us against everyone else to grab as much as we can, the left hemisphere spirit, and also I can be anything I like, which was never true and never will be true.
Yeah, so, entitlement. I've got one more question for you, but first tell us where people can go and find your work and those things.
Well, I have a website called Channel McGilchrist, which some people think is an imperative, but it's just a description. And
I'd love to channel some McGilchrist. I think that sounds great. Yeah.
And on it, you'll find a lot of, most of it is open to anyone. You don't have to pay. And there's a lot of my stuff there, many, many, many clips and some papers and things like that. There's also a members area, which if you want to go deeper, you can go into.
I'll put a link below for that, and people should go. Please do go support my guest who's come all this way to talk about this. Who's a heretic you admire?
Heretics. Well, they're mostly people who are now dead, like Bergson, the philosopher Henri Bergson, who was a heretic he wasn't so much a heretic in his time, but he became called a heretic, but actually he was a very profound thinker. Yes.
And what's the sort of line on him?
Ooh. He was very... He saw a lot of things that we've lost sight of, which are to do with the difference between the parts and the whole, for one thing, which is, for me, a very important insight, that the whole is not the same as the bits that you get when you break it up. And summing them up doesn't bring back that whole. It's in the connections. Everything is in the relations and in the connections. And he had an amazing ability to understand the difference between time thought of as a line or as moments in a line that string together to make like a chain of events or a chain of moments, and the idea of it as something that is indivisible and that we live, and it's not made out of a now and now and now and now. Now, that sounds like a small point, but actually a lot hangs on it, which is to do with seeing life as more like a melody than like a series of events in which each note is taken up with what went before and what comes afterwards. And it only is what it is when it has become a seamless whole. So, which isn't to say that, if it breaks off, it didn't mean anything, but even the melody that breaks off meant something for that time. So I think he's very great. Who do I admire that's writing now and speaking now? I like Douglas
Murray.
Murray.
Oh, he's great.
Yes.
I like that he uses antiquated insults. Christopher Hitchens used to do that a lot. Christopher Hitchens would say, "What brain rot? What brain rot possesses these people?" And no one talks like that, And Douglas Murray also, he just says, and they're very much playground school things. So I get that it's a little bit, maybe the left hemisphere too much coming in, but he will say to people, "Well, you're just in your pajamas all day. You need to get out the house," and things like that. And I know it's left, but I know it's a guilty pleasure listening to him say these things.
I prefer not to abuse people.
No, I know.
But I think he's good.
Yes.
And, other predictable people like Lionel Shriver, who I think is a very clever writer, and also a very brilliant novelist. I mean, I think her novels are full of interesting ideas.
Well, this conversation was a topic we need to talk about, as Lionel Shriver's book was titled. We need to talk about Kevin, wasn't it? Was that
Kevin? Yes.
We also needed to talk about this. Please do support Iain's work and go read it. I mean, people love Iain, so do go in the description and check all of that out. This is one of my favorite interviews I've ever done. So please make it go out there into the world. Hit the like button. That works. That does it. If you subscribe, most of you aren't even subscribed. You click subscribe, it makes the video go out. And people need to hear this, I think, in today's times. I'm sure if you're still listening or viewing at this point, you agree, and keep watching this channel.